Good evening, everyone. My name is Kyle Kuyers. I use he, him pronouns. I am the Director of Operations for the Kauffman Interfaith Institute here at Grand Valley State University, which seeks to advance equity and belonging for persons of all religious, secular, and spiritual identities by fostering human connection, interfaith understanding, and collective transformation on campus and in the wider community. On behalf of the Kauffman Institute and the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Justice for All, Faith Leaders and the Nonviolent Fight Against Poverty. This event, offered as a part of the Hauenstein Center's Common Ground initiative, will bring us into a conversation at the intersection of faith, class, and politics as we reflect on our deepest religious and constitutional values, and how to ensure a moral, ethical, and just democracy for everyone. As someone who served as an AmeriCorps Vista, addressing the complexities of poverty and food insecurity in rural southwestern Pennsylvania, my personal sense of calling to seminary was informed by seeing firsthand the impact faith communities can have when they collaborate to address both the symptoms of poverty and the systems that perpetuate it. In tonight's dialogue, we will explore the varied efforts of faith-based organizations working to alleviate the effects of poverty here in West Michigan, and discuss the proper roles of faith groups, government, philanthropy, and individual action in that work. We enter this conversation on poverty, recognizing that much of the economic progress and development of this nation resulted from the unpaid labor of persons of color, African and Caribbean people, as well as their descendants, who suffered the horrors of enslavement and later on dehumanization through segregation and Jim Crow laws. And we gather for this conversation through the lens of faith and spirituality, recognizing that we are on the ancestral lands of the people of the three fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi peoples. We are guests on their land, which has long been home to many expressions of native spiritualities and cultures that over centuries have been actively suppressed and outlawed. As we take tangible steps towards justice, we acknowledge these histories and encourage you to support specifically the Grand River Band of Odawa Indians in their ongoing efforts to secure federal recognition. And for more information on that, you can visit grandriverbands.com. May we persevere in the hope and promise of being one nation under God, indivisible with liberty and justice for all. Lastly, if I can take a brief moment for gratitude, I'd like to thank the Hauenstein Center staff for all of their hard work on tonight's program. Thank you to our three amazing speakers for being with us, for your gift of time, the wisdom that you'll share with us this evening, and your ongoing work within our community. And lastly, I want to honor and thank all of the unseen labor that makes this gathering possible. GVSU's amazing conference and events team, campus catering, Grand Valley Police Department, and our amazing custodial team. Thank you for your work in preparing this beautiful space for us. And so at this time, I'd like to introduce to you a fellow from the Hauenstein Center's Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. At each Hauenstein Center event, a CLA student is invited to share their personal reflections on leadership with our audience. And this evening, we are joined by Hannah Hosfeld. Hannah is a dedicated first-year educator and second-year fellow with the Cook Leadership Academy, where she currently serves as lead fellow. She's passionate about leadership, service, and educational equity. Hannah brings a wealth of knowledge in special education, advocacy, and community engagement to her work. She holds a Bachelor's of Science in Elementary and Special Education and is currently pursuing a Master's of Education in Autism Spectrum Disorder. In her free time, Hannah serves as president of the Michigan Council for Exceptional Children Student Board and is an active advocate through the Legislative Advocacy and Action Committee. Through her role as a special educator and community volunteer, Hannah continues to champion inclusive practices and empower others through mentorship and leadership development. And as a lead fellow, she is honored to support the growth of emerging leaders and contribute to the legacy of the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. Friends, please join me in welcoming Hannah.
Thank you, Kyle, for that warm welcome. As Kyle mentioned, my name is Hannah Hosfeld. I'm a special education teacher and a lead fellow in the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. It's a true honor to be here tonight among people who, just by being in this room, show a shared commitment to a more just and compassionate world. As I reflect on my leadership journey here, I think about where it began, not with a title, but with a responsibility. The responsibility to show up for my students, for my community, and for people whose voices often go unheard. The CLA has shaped me into a leader that understands that leadership is not about status, but it's about presence. It's about using your voice, not just to speak, but to listen. And more than anything, it's about noticing who isn't at the table and making sure that there's a seat for them. As an educator, my leadership begins in the classroom. Every day I work to shape not just successful students, but ethical and empathetic humans. Young people who are learning to lead with equity in mind and who are learning to advocate for others as fiercely as they are learning to advocate for themselves. Tonight's conversation asks us to reflect on the roles of faith, class, and poverty in fighting and education in fighting poverty. And I believe that one of those most powerful battlegrounds is our public schools. Because poverty isn't abstract. It walks into school with our students every day. It looks like students who are struggling to focus because they're hungry. It looks like a parent that cannot make parent-teacher conferences, not for lack of investment, but because they're working beyond hard to provide for their family. It looks like big behaviors that are a result of things that are much more serious than academics. For my students with disabilities, the impact of these things is often compounded with navigating complicated healthcare systems, limited resources, and constant reminders that the world isn't always built with them in mind. I believe deeply that learning can't happen without basic needs being met. And before we talk about reading levels or test scores, we must ask, does this child feel safe? Does this child feel seen? The organizations and the individuals that you're healed from tonight are essential. They're a first wave of support, and we need to partner with them. Government, philanthropy, schools, communities, individuals, all of us in this room have a role in disrupting the cycles that provide families with this struggle. So I leave you with this. Find your battleground. Maybe it's a classroom. Maybe it's a city council. Maybe it's your church or your neighborhood. Wherever it is, show up, speak up, and make sure that there's space for others to do the same. Because if we want a truly more moral, ethical, and just society, it starts with how we treat the most vulnerable. And that work begins with us, in classrooms like mine, in communities like yours, and in rooms like this one. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Can we just take one more moment to give Hannah another round of applause? As you all know, one of our signature programs is the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. And every time that we have someone like Hannah on stage, we are able to tangibly see what the work that we do for that academy means for the students who are in it, but also for our community at large. And every time I see it, I tend to even get a little choked up, right? Because we see the leaders that we're putting out into our communities, and it's just a really special thing. So thanks for what you're doing, Hannah, and thanks for setting the stage so lovely for our conversation tonight. So again, as mentioned, my name is Megan Radecki. I am pleased to serve as your director at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. And with me tonight are a few guests who I will briefly introduce, and then I will let them introduce themselves. To my left is Shannon Jamal Hollemans, who is from the First Congregational United Church, or UCC of Lowell, sorry. Adrian Goodstall is with North Kent Connect. And Reggie Smith is a ministry consultant with the Christian Reformed Church in North America. Most recently retired from serving the Roosevelt Park Community Association or Neighborhood Association. So thank you all for being here this evening.
Thank you.
I will remind us that as is the tradition of the Hauenstein Center Common Ground events tonight, its conversation isn't necessarily about finding out who's right and who's wrong when it comes to how we approach poverty alleviation and how we view that in terms of our faith traditions. It's really about sharing ideas, sharing approaches, and figuring out how can we take that new information and turn it into action for ourselves, for our communities, and how we can use that to make a positive difference for those around us. So thank you all again for being here as part of the conversation. We're going to dive in, and I'm going to have each of our panelists here just share a little bit about the unique perspective that you bring to tonight's conversation. If you can share a little bit about your own personal and professional experiences and how they've shaped the way that you see the connection between your faith and poverty alleviation work. And Shannon, we'll start with you.
Sure. Thanks for having me tonight. Again, my name is Shannon Jamal Hollemans. I'm a pastor in Lowell, Michigan, but I grew up in Grand Rapids on the southeast side. And I grew up in an interfaith household. My mother is Christian. My father was a Muslim, a Shia Muslim. And so I had the privilege of seeing the world from those perspectives, and that really informed the way that I understand faith and the way I understand poverty alleviation, especially. I feel like the Christian community that I grew up, it was more suburban, West Michigan, so it was more insulated from poverty. And the poverty relief efforts that I saw the church doing were mostly focused on overseas, on sending money to distant communities to do the work, very hands-off. There wasn't a lot of hands-on work. My father grew up, he was born in the Middle East, grew up in West Africa, before coming to the United States, and grew up with very familiar with poverty. He was trafficked to West Africa because his mother couldn't afford to feed him, so she signed a contract with a man to send him there, and lived there and worked there for 10 years from the age of 13 to 23 on his own without any family to raise him. So poverty was something really close to his heart, even though once, he came to West Michigan and married my mom, he had more access to privilege than he'd ever had in his life. But he never forgot where he came from. And there's this Muslim saying, if poverty were a man, I'd kill him, that my dad used to say. He was nonviolent, committed to nonviolence like most Muslims. But yeah, that was something that was important to him, because I think he was a small business owner in East Town for many years and saw just the impact, especially in the 80s and 90s, of poverty in his community there, and really had a heart for it and a desire. And then he really passed that on to me.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Great.
Adrian. Hi, I'm Adrian Goodstall. I'm the Executive Director at North Kent Connect, a social service agency that serves our neighbors that are living in poverty in Northern Kent County. I spent the last 10 years at Mel Trotter Ministries, an urban ministry, working with individuals that are experiencing homelessness. When I think about what my faith and my work in alleviating poverty, it's my faith that drives me to do this work. It's really difficult work, but I wake up every day and I do it because I believe what it says in the Bible, which is to care for the marginalized and the oppressed. And I have seen over the 15 plus years that I've worked in this space, people who have just been forgotten about, who have been at their absolute worst, but who have risen out of it. And I think that gives me hope to know that if we come together, there are ways to alleviate poverty, and people just need to be valued and be seen as having the will to do that. So that to me is kind of what keeps me going in this really tough work. I come with my white privilege and I see that, and I just need to make sure that, when I'm having conversations around what those intersections are, that I'm being transparent in that. And again, it's just, for me, it's been the work and the calling that I've had on my life for 15 years, to just keep doing the hard stuff, because I know that with will and community collaboration and all sectors coming together, we can make the needle move in people experiencing poverty.
Thank you. Reggie.
My parents came from a little town in Mississippi called Brookville, Mississippi, and they came as part of the Great Migration, and they moved to Chicago and to North Lawndale. North Lawndale at the time was becoming predominantly African-American. It was predominantly Russian Jews. It had, Lawndale is known for as a place in which it went from predominantly Jewish to predominantly African-American in less than 10 years, which is the fastest that's ever happened to a neighborhood. And so when my parents came up, there were 7 of us, and in my neighborhood, it was considered poor. So I grew up poor. I grew up having to go to the welfare office. I grew up having to have lunches at school. I grew up with having families and friends in which there was a struggle to know where your next meal was coming from. And so when I was the first from my family to go to college and to come back because I wanted to be a lawyer, and then to find out that I wasn't as smart as I thought I was. and needed a little bit more work. And so when I came here to Grand Rapids for seminary, I went to Calvin Seminary. I was only one of 2 African Americans there at the time, and I wanted to go back to Chicago to go back and help people. but the Lord had different plans for me. And after a stint in Patterson, I came back to Grand Rapids and I pastored the Roosevelt Park Christian Reformed Church for 20 years as a African American of a white church in a Latino neighborhood for 20 years. And so that's why I'm confused. And part of that was being in that neighborhood of Roosevelt Park. It is one of the two, which is the poorest in Grand Rapids. And I had the opportunity to be the president of the neighborhood association for 28 of my 29 years on the board, and know firsthand how we try to at least cultivate the conditions to at least address poverty in Roosevelt Park.
Thank you for that. So let's provide a little bit more context and talk a little bit about how we understand poverty, so we're all kind of on the same page tonight. So an indicator that I often reference that I know all the folks here are very familiar with is called ALICE. And ALICE is an acronym that stands for Asset Limited Income Constrained. And it's a descriptor for families in Michigan who basically are working poor. And so an individual may be working, but based on cost of living, they don't have quite enough to make ends meet, or it's a struggle to make those ends meet. And so, for example, in 2022, that's when the most complete set of data from our recent survey has been taken. 41% of families in the state of Michigan qualified as ALICE. And of that, 13% of them were below the federal poverty level, and 28% of them were above the federal poverty level, but at that below the ALICE standard. In Kent County, 36% of our families were part of that ALICE category. In Montcalm, which borders an area that Adrian works in, so if you think about Greenville and the surrounding areas, that number is even higher at 44%. If you wonder, well, Megan, what does that mean in terms of dollars and cents? The household survival budget, which is what they calculate to figure out, okay, what is the bare minimum that you need to survive? And that could be anything from rent to food, childcare, transportation, et cetera. The dollar amount for one adult and one child, bare minimum that you need, is $50,000 in Kent County. And if it's two adults and two children, it's $80,000. If you couple that with, I think the statistic is that 75% of the most commonly held jobs in Michigan pay $20 or less an hour. So if you think about two adults, two children needing $80,000, that's both people needing at least to make $20 an hour. But 75% of the most common jobs in Michigan are below that. Mm-hmm. So there's a little context for you. And as we think about that, let's dive in. So knowing that that's kind of the scenario, what are some of the biggest challenges for those you serve that they face? And how have organizations like the ones you've been part of or other faith-based that you've seen, how have they responded to those challenges? So challenges that people face and responses.
I'm happy to talk about that. So North Kent Connect, the population and the families that we serve are ALICE population. And so again, as you said, it's those that are the working poor, and they are just one unexpected expense away from spiraling into homelessness. And so, it's how most of our families are living at 60% of housing cost burden, meaning 60% of their salary is going to pay for their rent and utilities. It does not leave much room for extra. So, and especially in the rural communities, there's the transportation barrier. So most often families have to own a car in order to get to where they're going to take their kid to childcare and school and go grocery shopping and the doctors. But if you are living paycheck to paycheck and you need an oil change or you're going to put food on the table, guess what you're going to do? So our families are constantly in this tug and pull of how do I provide for my family and continue to what we call try and move out of that Alice level, which I'll speak about later on, that there's just challenges for people moving up the economic mobility. And so for us, that's where we come in. North Kent Connect has been around for 53 years. We were founded by churches to really fill the need for food insecurity. And it's birthed into what it is today, where we're not only just providing healthy foods for families so they don't have to worry about, where they're going to get their next meal, but we're helping with transportation, we're helping with housing, we're helping them try and find a more livable wage with budgeting. And, so it's really, we're kind of a one-stop resource, if you will, to help people that are at that Alice level get out of that Alice level on a pathway to economic independence. And I'll say this, we absolutely cannot do it without our churches. Our church community in Northern Kent is our biggest supporters. And I've been there for 7 months. And it's been absolutely beautiful and inspiring to truly see the church being the church. They are walking alongside our clients. They're doing life. They're supporting them. They're encouraging them. They're giving of their time, treasure, and talent. And so for us, the faith community and the intersection of our nonprofit is hand in hand. And we're hopeful that we will be able to see more of our families move out of that poverty level.
Thank you.
I can speak to that too. So the church that I pastor in Lowell has really taught me a lot about poverty in a rural community because I was only familiar with an urban context before that. But part of the reason I took the church was because I'm a historical researcher as a hobby. And in researching the Auburn Hills neighborhood in Grand Rapids, which was the city's first planned integrated neighborhood, it was purchased in the 1960s, the land by a group of African-American men to address the issue of redlining, right? Which prohibited African-American families that made enough money from living in middle-class communities. And when I was researching the Auburn Hills neighborhood, and we're working on getting a historical designation for it right now from the state, I discovered that a group of churches, when the city of Grand Rapids kept throwing obstacles in the way of the developers of the Auburn Hills community, demanding more money, and these were men who had already invested tens of thousands of dollars in this. And the city said, no, you have to have almost all the money down before you can start building. They just kept throwing things up. It was churches in the community, including Park Church, Fountain Street Church, and our little church in Lowell that said, we're going to support you guys. So we're going to come up with a fund. You can pay us back whenever you can, but here, draw on this fund to get the money that you need right now. And our church in Lowell was the first church to contribute to that fund. And I'm so proud of that. And that was part of what made me take the job, because I'm like, this is a church that actually takes racial justice and community development seriously. And I've seen that since I've been there. About 30 years ago, the pastor of the church and some members of other local churches started a ministry in Lowell called Flat River Outreach Ministries, which does a lot of affordable housing, access for people who have food insecurity, just all kinds of issues. They've recently started transportation. And our church has its own organization that started about 9 years ago now called Open Table, Lowell's Open Table, that feeds about 100 people every Thursday night a free meal, no conditions, no questions asked, no messaging like you have to come to church or hear a sermon. It's just a free meal. And that's usually where I am on Thursday nights, because that's where people gather to come and hang out. And it always surprises me that people come like an hour early. We serve the meal at 5, but people come at 4, not to grab a table, but just to hang out with each other. Like, we give people a place for community. And I think that's dignifying, that respects the humanity of people. And it gives them a sense of pride, like, this is our place too. And we're accepted here without any preconditions or anything like that.
That's wonderful. And now I have to apologize for hosting a Thursday event. Sorry, and to your constituents. Reggie, how about you? What kind of challenges have you seen in the neighborhoods that you've worked in the past?
At Roosevelt Park, it's the thing that really hit me when I first moved there was that the only book that was in people's houses was the phone book. And if you think about that, the average middle class house has at least 20 to 30 books in their house. And when a little kid by the name of Alikio came to the neighborhood association and asked little Mary Angelo, did she have an atlas? Because he needed to do his homework. at Hall School, which is right across the street. And she didn't. And that became the impetus for building our own library. But at first, we asked the Kent Library District to build us one. And they politely told us no. And we say, okay, then it means for us to do that ourselves. And through philanthropy and through Christians who were a part of that neighborhood association board, we built our own library because we weren't going to wait for nobody else to do it for us. And now that Kid Alikio is a college grad. And those are the kind of challenges when we think about education and that we meet those critical basic things, but also that we have to think about how does education become a justice issue? And that justice has to have something to do about can a kid get adequate education to be able to have a vision, as Adrian and Shannon has already talked about, of moving beyond where they're at.
Sir, would you maybe expound on that a little bit more? Faith traditions often emphasize both charity and justice. Charity addressing immediate needs, food, books, transportation, justice seeking to change structures that create those needs in the first place. In your view, are faith communities too focused on one side or the other? How do we strike the right balance between charity and justice?
We love hanging out on the margins, don't we? We like choosing one or the other. When it's actually, when we think about, we can't just have binary answers because that traps us. And it means that we have to go either one way or the other. But rather, how do we think about a third way? A third way in which both of those things are working in tandem with one another. And so when the Neighborhood Association found out that there was extra money available after the millage in the early 2000s, and Hall School needed to be redone because it was over 75 years old. It was overcrowded. We were sending our kids out of the neighborhood to go to other schools. And so we sought the governor and the city to say, why don't you give that 11 million that is left from the millage to us? And we had to fight to get that millage in order for Cesar Chavez School to be built. And so it's really doing both of those things at the same time. It's not either or. And when we try to think of ways that it goes beyond binary, we can actually come up with some more imaginative ways in which to do and to answer that question.
Yeah. Shannon or Adrian, other thoughts on justice versus charity?
Yeah, I think of it in three ways usually. Ministries of mercy and relief, which are to meet the immediate needs, as long as advocacy and justice focus. But in between, there is that community development piece, right? Which I know Reggie is really familiar with. And I think that's a lot of what North Kent Connect does, which is investing in communities in ways that develop both organizations, businesses, for long-term goals, so that it's not just one shot here and it's not just talking to Congress. It's about what are we doing to invest in this community right now, so that in the days ahead, we're going to have systems in place that can address the long-term issues with poverty. Personally, I worked in social justice for many years and did a lot of political advocacy. So I tend to lean toward the political advocacy piece because that's really where my heart is. I think it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer who died 80 years ago this week. He was murdered by Nazi regime in Germany. He was a Lutheran pastor. And he said, you know, it's one thing to lift up the wheel of oppression off of people. It's another thing to just take the spoke out, throw a spoke in the wheel to stop it altogether, right? So it stops oppressing people so that injustice is no longer occurring. And I think for me, I really like to focus on the systemic pieces because I feel like as much as we are gifted with things, as much as we pull ourselves by our bootstraps, there are still systems in place that really we have to work to address the systemic issues, or we're just going to keep having to do these ministries to meet immediate needs and for relief.
And I think it's, you know, being not a pastor, but being somebody who does a lot of advocacy and justice work, it's pastors like the two of you who have to lead by example to the other faith communities that are more comfortable sitting in that space of charity, because I think there's an immediate gratification to care for the immediate need, and churches are called to do that. They're called to care for the poor, right? And so they sit in that space because it's more comfortable than doing the hard work of looking for long-term transformation. And I think both are the same. And I think church and faith communities are in a unique role that play both of those, providing for immediate needs, but then using their voice to do that justice work. And so there's an interconnectedness, and it's leading by example for those faith communities that are doing that to the other faith communities that might be a little bit more shy about doing justice work and staying in that charity space.
And equipping people really, right, to do that kind of advocacy. One, privilege we have being part of the United Church of Christ is the United Church of Christ has an office of advocacy, and they send out regular action alerts. So today's action alert was, urge Congress to vote for a moral budget, because right now the budget is cutting SNAP, it's cutting Medicaid benefits, and it's investing a lot of funds in immigration detention. So they're saying if you're a person of faith in the United Church of Christ, call your representative, email your representative, and let them know this is not okay. And so that's something I'm passing on to my congregation tomorrow. And I think sometimes as pastors, we can be a little bit afraid, or leaders of any organization, we can be afraid of speaking out because we're like, oh, are people going to be offended? But I think we're past that. It's the time for courage where we just need to speak up and speak out and say people's lives are at stake here. And if we recognize the image of God in every single person, then we have to speak up for every single person.
So that's really interesting. Because, we talk a lot about in the public sphere, in the public sector, right? Separation of church and state. We know that there's different things happening around the country where those lines are being blurred a little bit more. I think there were stories from our community about pastors preaching from the pulpit about who to vote for this last year, which is interesting, certainly. But so when we have these kinds of issues and they're framed as moral issues, but they get pulled in the political sphere, like how should a church or a person go about talking about these issues so that they can resonate even in some of these areas where there's been a separation before?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, right, it's about humanity. Like, what is the shared universal thread that can, go across political and religious lines? It's about the shared humanity of your neighbor and human beings. And so how do you share it from that lens and take the political, even though it's hard, right, out of it, and just bring it back to, your neighbor who is in need and who everybody has the right to thrive and to have their basic needs met. And so I think that's, it's kind of dismantling that political lens of it and bringing it back to the humanity of the issue at hand. I think I always think about like Jeremiah 29:11 that comes to mind, right? Is that, I have plans to prosper you and not to harm you, and plans to give you a hope and a future for everybody, regardless of your circumstances and your background.
Yeah, I think political advocacy takes courage, right? It's not something that people are necessarily comfortable with, especially with West Michigan nice culture. And Christian nationalism, frankly, is a cancer in this country right now. And as Christians or people of faith, we should be the most offended by that, by people hijacking and using it for corruption, for power, for control. That is not what Christ was about at all, not the Christ that I follow. It's about serving others, protecting those who are vulnerable, lifting up the marginalized, oppressed, and centering them, because that is what Christ consistently did. I think that's what the Quran teaches. That's what the Torah teaches. That's something that I think we can all rally around together. We just need to put aside our egos and our desires for power and control, because that can really be harmful.
So the phrase liberty and justice for all, and I think Kyle even referenced that, is central to our American ideals. What do you see as the biggest barriers to achieving true justice for all, particularly in economic terms? Reggie, you had mentioned education. Do you see that as the biggest barrier? What else is out there that keeps us from achieving economic justice?
Folk need money. It's, I've always found it interesting, especially, growing up in the Black church and how racial segregation was used against people like my parents who had to leave Mississippi to come to Chicago for economic reasons. And how even in my own community right now is how do we develop those kinds of ways in which people can have a dream and have a vision, think about a business, like with Shannon's father, having a business. And right now, generating and incubating businesses in Roosevelt Park is one of the biggest things going on right now, because we have to move all the kind of barriers out of the way in terms of capital and credit. Capital and credit is now the new, how can I say, is the new thing. Whoever gets it and who doesn't get it. And how that becomes now a fight for how communities lift themselves up. And if you think about it right now, a community has to have $1 circulate at least 8 times in this community before it goes out. And if it doesn't, then that wealth does not return back to it. And so one of the things that we keep coming back to is that we have to have the freedom for people like, I'm thinking of Javier, who started a supermarket. And his supermarket is doing well, but he can't get credit because he has to go through all these other barriers that, I don't know, white folk ain't got to go through. You get the benefit of a doubt. And yet he wants the same dream just as anybody else. And we have to develop those kind of conditions in order that if Javier can get it just as anybody else, but that also means advocacy. That you have to get in some folks' face. And sometimes we have to get in some of our churches' folks' faces because they want us to continue. And I say this in terms of West Michigan, we have more nonprofits per capita than any other city in the United States. Think about that. Why is that? Wouldn't it be better if Grand Rapids was known as a place in which people of color could have businesses that thrive more than per capita than any other city in the United States? Wouldn't that be good too? And so it's coming back to that whole thing of it's not either or, it's both and.
And I think we've seen that in Grand Rapids, right? Where things like race, gender, sexual identity, they all play such bigger role than they should in how well someone can do in their life, right? And like for me, I've had to interrogate my own family history. I think this is something we all should do, is to look at what privileges did we have over the years and what losses did we have to get us to where we are today, right? I look at my mom's father, my white grandfather. He came back from World War II and got the GI Bill and was able to build his own house, right? That was something that white soldiers could access. Black soldiers, most of them were not able to access that simply because of their race. And so I see that privilege that was able to be leveraged in my family. My grandfather owned a business. So when my dad came here, married my mother, he was able to get a small business loan. He was able to borrow money from my grandfather to buy the building in Easttown where he had his business, right? And so my dad was able to run a business in a Black community where Black people could not run a business successfully for many years because banks in this community especially have a reputation for saying they'll lend to African Americans and then pulling the loans or not lending to African Americans at all. And those are the issues that need to be addressed if we're going to move forward, right? Because that should not be the case. We all should have that equal opportunity with liberty and justice for all, but I think it remains an ideal and not something that we're seeing lived out.
Adrienne, anything to add about
Yeah,
barriers?
that was my, it's that mobility of economic mobility and the awarded to have your own home and assets. And so they've said it all. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So let's turn the corner a little bit and talk about, you all are boots on the ground doing things here. What efforts have you seen in West Michigan that are working? What gives you hope about addressing poverty and where we need to go? You shared some examples from your own organizations, but what's giving you hope about things you're seeing in West Michigan?
One big issue in our community is affordable housing. I think this, you addressed that as well. I think the average home price, I don't know if it's in Lowell or Kent County, but is $450,000, which is really high. And most people will never have access to getting a home for that much. So the Flat River Outreach Ministry that was started in Lowell 30 years ago by the pastor of our church and other members of the community, they've addressed things like food insecurity over the years, transportation, and now are addressing affordable housing. And they're building 17 units of affordable housing in Lowell. They've asked the churches in the community to partner with them in this, and the youth group from our church is committed to raising $2,500 so they can buy the appliances for one of those units, which is really cool. And I think we all have to take ownership in, okay, this is an issue in our community. How can we work to address it? And I love it that our kids are like, let's do this together. This is how we can address this.
Yeah, and I think similar to that, I think, for me over the years, I've really seen a deepening in collaboration across all sectors, private and public and nonprofits and businesses and faith communities really coming together because they recognize that the work is very difficult and we're never going to move the needle if we do it in silos. And I've been doing this work and at many, many tables for 17 years. And I will say that West Michigan has the ability to really change the trajectory of poverty. And it's the will. And I think that over the last couple of years, I have seen this deepening, and it's encouraging to see that. It's not the nonprofit's problem or the church's problem. People are coming together to use their resources. And the other piece of that too is I think that we're really finally operating from rich data in our community to truly know what is the gap and what are the needs that we have and how can we use that data to start making informed decisions and strategic plans on how to move forward. And funders want to see that too. What are we asking the funders to help support? And so I'm encouraged by that. And, for Northern Kent, we're kind of this island on our own that often gets forgotten about when we're having these large conversations around affordable housing and transportation. We're concentrated on the urban core and all of the neighbors in the north are, not at the table. And so we've seen a lot of synergy with businesses to say, we've got to make sure that affordable housing, when we're talking about that, we're looking at Northern Kent as well. So it's encouraging.
Yeah.
Much work to do still, but encouraging.
Yeah.
At Roosevelt Park, we have factory yards that's going to be coming up in 3 phases, and that's about 474 units, which used to be the Okila brass, McInerney's metal, and on Godfrey. And part of what the neighborhood association does is that it has an area-specific plan, and that area-specific plan means that a developer cannot come into our neighborhood without talking to us first. And because of that, developers have to come to us and say, what are you going to do in order to have affordable housing in your development? And in our conversations with factory yards, they said that they will put together at least 10 to 12% of the units will be for those who fit in that AMR, that they can live there. And they will not be ghettoized, that they be in a certain section of the building, but they will be scattered throughout the building so that they are just not this section of the poor that's in the building, but spread out through the entire building. And factory yards was one of kind of the first ones who said, we're for that, because they were going to get away with it anyway. But I think there's something that neighborhoods can do, especially in terms of Grand Rapids, is an area-specific plan says that this is the way this community wants to form itself and how it wants to build its future. And because we did that, we've now gotten to a place where the residents of my neighborhood feel like they have a say. They feel like they have power. And one of the things that we don't talk about in West Michigan, power. yet it's one of the big themes in the Bible. Jesus talks a lot about power. God talks a lot about power. Talks a lot about power, about how the early church is supposed to conduct itself, about how do you share power and how do you give away power. The power should not just be for a selected few.
Mm-hmm.
It should be for the flourishing of all of God's people, that all will have what they have in need of, regardless of where their station is in life.
I think it's interesting that you say, and I'm encouraged to hear that these developers came to Roosevelt Park Association because in my experience, that is where we're falling short still, is making sure that those with lived experience that are going to be directly impacted not only have a seat at the table, but have a voice at the table where decisions are being made. And I think that, again, it's that power dynamic. And so that's encouraging to hear that about factory yards in Roosevelt, because I don't see that in other neighborhoods and tables. So, yeah.
Well, and it bears saying, right, that as much as we see helpful things, it's important to study the past to know how not to repeat mistakes.
Correct.
So while we're encouraged by things that are happening, examples of things where maybe we failed in the past or currently that we think we need to be improving upon.
Yeah, one of the, I've seen in my work when I worked at Mel Trotter Ministries is the failure around permanent supportive housing. And so permanent supportive housing is for individuals who have significant mental health and substance use and a disability and are chronic homeless. And so they require much more support and wraparound services. And so, back in like 1982 to the 90s, we built all of these massive permanent supportive housing units, all concentrated poverty down in the Hartside neighborhood. And what we did was we kind of put a little Band-Aid on it by saying, well, we'll have some wraparound services, some mental health, maybe case management. And when the funding got pulled from Network 180 back in 2015, all of those services got taken out of those permanent supportive housing units, basically leaving the most vulnerable in our community left to just falter. And most of them ended up back out on the streets. And so, I think we just need to your point, learn from our mistakes and what is it that we know that we need to do to make sure that our most vulnerable in our community are successful. And so I think that was a huge failure, and it concentrated poverty, and it just perpetuated people from cycling in and out of homelessness for many, many years, which is trauma.
Adrian, can you speak a little bit more to that? I think there's some people who believe that people who fall into poverty, right, that it's either a result of systemic forces or it's just a lot of bad choices that person made. And can you talk a little bit more about your experience and how you've seen that?
I mean, I cannot tell you how many times I've found myself in spaces fighting the narrative of if they just pick themselves up by their bootstraps, or if they just got a job, or if they just made better life decisions, they wouldn't find themselves in the situation. And while, yes, decisions can lead to poverty and, and like homelessness, most often not, it's the systemic barriers that are against them that is never going to allow them to escape that. And many people who find themselves, in like chronic homelessness, it's because of significant mental health, and the system has failed them. There is not enough mental health supports. There's not enough health care. And so the systems that are put in place are failing people, even if they were making the right decisions and their own personal efforts, they find themselves stuck. And so I think that it's there's complexity to that. I think there's the truth lies somewhere in between, but it isn't about poor decisions that people are making. It's often, when you pull back the curtain, it's the systems that are in place that are keeping people where they're at.
And I've seen that in the church as well. I've seen a lot of efforts to try and address issues in very targeted, focused ways, but not with an intersectional understanding of the actual issue, which is power, as Reggie said. So they want to look at race, or they want to look at gender, but they're not looking at them together. They're not looking at sexual identity and gender identity and how that impacts it, right? Like, we have to consider all these things, because all of these things are factors, and you can't just compartmentalize them into different issues, because it is all connected. And so I think that's a place where we as the church have failed. But I think there is hope because there are people now recognizing it. It's just slow coming, right? LGBTQ youth and young adults are, I don't know how many times more likely to be homeless or unhoused than the average population, but it is much higher. And I didn't realize that until I started attending a church in Grand Rapids that was mostly LGBTQ members. And I'd never known so many people who had been unhoused in my whole life as that community, where people's like, yeah, I served couches for a year, or yeah, I lived here in this person's basement for a while, and then my car, and then this, right? Because of family rejection, because of health issues, a number of reasons, but we have to be addressing those kinds of things as well, because it's systemic, maybe a little bit personal choice, but there are so many factors at play that we need to recognize.
Yeah. So it's 40% of youth that are experiencing homelessness identify as LGBTQ, and they have been, cast out from their church community and from their homes, and just find themselves in very, very awful situations, couch surfing and being sexually exploited. And
Thank you. I have one more question for the panel, and then we're going to move into some Q&A. So we will have roving microphones in a moment, but be thinking about questions that you may want to ask our panel here. So we are going to end this portion on a little bit of a brighter note. So if each of you, and Reggie, maybe we'll start with you, if you can share one practical step that individuals, folks in this audience, or communities can take to address poverty in ways that align with whatever faith or ethical values they may have. What's one practical step?
I'd say one practice is to get involved at your local level, whatever that is. And I think that you will see probably the most, you probably can make the most difference at that level. Not to say that you can't still continue to do the systemic stuff, but if people don't change unless you come in close proximity to them, that's what Brian Stevenson says. Yeah. You need to have a face to the problem that you want to be taken care of. If you don't, then what happens is that you will get frustrated. And I don't want you to get frustrated. So find the one thing or the one thing that you can be a part of and take the long view. Practice a vow of stability. Because what people in poverty are looking for is someone who will take a vow of stability in their life.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've kind of touched on it, and it's a little bit similar to that. It's show up, get involved with community-based advocacy and supports, use your voice. There's power in numbers, and don't be afraid to share the stories of the loved ones and your neighbors that you're seeing that are being harmed by the systems. And to your point, just be proximate, know what's going on in your community, and fight for it and show up.
Yeah, I mean, I think community is key, right? And I've seen that in the church that I pastor. There are people there all week. It's church on Sunday morning, but Senior Neighbors of Kent County operates their Lowell Center out of our building Monday through Friday. Gilda's Club is there every Tuesday doing free grief support and free cancer support. We have the Lowell Women's Club who meets and they fundraise and they support all these local organizations doing things to help people in the community. Lowell Pride operates out of our building. Like, just being together and working together and collaborating has so much power. And I think that's where our hope is. Through the Senior Neighbors program, I've met a lot of people living in poverty. And I remember last year, we have this small food pantry that's run by people in the church who fill it every week when they come to church with bags of groceries. And it's just one set of shelves. It's not huge. But one of the women who came to Senior Neighbors regularly said, "Hey, can I give you some feedback?" And I said, "Sure." She said, "I like the stuff in the pantry, but can I give you a list of what is actually helpful for us?" And I said, "Of course." I didn't realize that, when you can't afford eggs, you can use mayo as a substitute for eggs, right? You use 3 tablespoons of mayo for 1 egg. So she's like, "Can you get jars of mayo?" I'm like, yeah, we can do that. Just getting a list from her of things like this is what people need and what we make. That was super helpful. And I think that's what gives me hope is when we're listening to people and actually meeting their felt needs and giving them the dignity and respect of actually serving them in the way they want to be served. Because they're really our partners in this.
I love that. So a vow of stability, which I also love. We all need to leave and take a vow of stability. We need to show up and we need to be good listeners. And Shannon, I have to say, it reminds me of a personal story. When I was a kid, we often did food drives at my school. And whether it was for local communities or Appalachia or you name it. And you do the thing where your mom says, go pick something out of the pantry that you want to donate. And inevitably, I was one of those like, tomato soup or pineapple chunk kids because those are the things I didn't want to eat. And I remember, I think I was in high school when someone once said to me, why would you give people the things that you don't want to eat? And I was so convicted right there that after that, it was only the good stuff that was going. But until someone says that to you, right? Or until you have that mentality shift or you listen to someone, you don't know. And so the act of listening tonight for all of you who are here is also just such a powerful step, right? That we would go out of our way to be aware and to be more informed of the things that are going on.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, with that, we would love to hear from the audience. I've got to assume there's a couple questions out here. So if you have one and want to raise your hand, a mic will magically appear next to you. And we'd love to take your question. Oh, we have one right down here with Hillary.
Always got to get the first. Oh,
There's a mic. Oh, Hillary, there's a microphone coming.
Thank you. I'm curious as to the library in Roosevelt Park is an appealing story as to your difficulties. How have you got a library? How did that get resolved?
I mean, how do we build it?
Yes. What did you do when the Kent library system turned you down? How did you approach it?
Oh,
What did you do?
what did we do?
Is there a library there now?
Yeah, we built our second one.
All right. How did you how did you attack that problem and what can be learned from that? What did you do? Where did you go? The Auburn Hills people apparently went to the churches and got the backing they needed. And that's the lesson. And you all have talked about the lessons over and over again, get involved and all the things you've said, but I'm just curious because it's an appealing story.
Well, it's a little white lady. A little white lady named Mary Angelo, who was the director at that time. And when she brought up the whole issue about the library, she got into action and brought the board on board to say this is what we're going to do. We're going to build our own library.
Now, which board are you talking about? The
Roosevelt Park Neighborhood Association.
All right, but what about okay. And she was on that board.
She was the director. She was the executive director, and I was president of the board at the time. And we got some philanthropists, some guy by the name of Peter Cook. You may have heard of him. And really appealed to him to say that this is the need that's happening in the neighborhood that you grew up in. And that spoke to him. And so Peter talked to a couple of his other friends and said, we're going to build this library. Well, who's going to run it? Well, we talked to the Catholic nuns, and they said, we will run it for you for free. And they did that for 15 years. And then the library got so big after about 5 years that we said, we have to build a new one. And so we ended up building a new one about 2 blocks away from where the original one was. And we ended up doubling our space. And now that place has probably have more kids in there than any other place after school. It is simply because there was a need that needed to be met. And it gave a vision that, again, what I said, that now most of those kids have books in their homes. Mark Twain was right. Travel makes the world bigger. And you travel if you got a book. And the church is a place that started universities. I'm just saying.
Thanks, Reggie. Other questions?
May I just, okay.
I think Bree has one. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Karen.
I do. I'm just so pleased to be hearing about these faith-based ministries and what you're doing. And I know that our church is a downtown church, and we have Dégagé is right near to us. And I'm wondering, there are Dégagé coupons that we can all get. Is something like that helpful? You know, I'm stopping always where I live is downtown, and there's always somebody that is homeless that is needing help. And if I run out of Dégagé things, I'm sorry, but is something like that, I mean, spreading the word about all of that sort of thing, that those things are helpful?
Absolutely.
And also we have a spa day, like one day every month. And it's for haircuts and it's for pedicures and it's just for a lot of things. Calvin brings nurses there to do it. Do you hear about all these things that are happening? Do you have a good way of knowing? I mean, you're doing so much in Lowell and you're doing a lot in the Rockford area. Do you have a good kind of collaboration and hear about all these sorts of things that are available and in our area? I mean, I'm thrilled to know that the churches are really fundamental.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know what church you attend because we were very involved with the spa day. And, you know, I think that it just really, it shows an individual that they have worth and value, right? That because of their circumstance doesn't mean that they don't want their hair cut or their feet pedicured, right? And it's a beautiful thing that your church has been doing for decades. And so, yes, I know firsthand the feedback that I've received from the women at Dégagé and the women at Meltrotter that they look forward to that event. And the Dégagé dollars are great. We get that, asked that often. What do we do when somebody's panhandling, right? I mean, that's the question. My very first response is look them in the eye and see them as a human being. And, you know, I think that you have to do what your heart calls you to do. If you feel called to give money, give money. If you feel called to give Dégagé dollars, give Dégagé dollars. The easiest and you can always have in your car, depending on the weather, hand warmers, right? Socks. You can give those items out. In the summertime, you can have cooling wraps. You can have bottles of water, right? But the most important thing is to see the individual as a human being. And so, yes, to answer your question, just, you know, the services that your church offers is very well received. And I think that Dégagé dollars is a great way to be able to have something in your pocket when you're out in the community and you see somebody in need. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for being here. It's been really lovely to hear all of you speak on this topic. So what I wanted to ask about is at the beginning of this talk, we talked about the fact that there are these poverty markers that you termed Alice. And then we talked about some statistics in which, you know, there's a certain proportion of families in Michigan who live below the poverty line. But then there's an even greater proportion of these people who are experiencing these Alice markers. So I guess my question is, do you think that that's a barrier in this fight, that there are people who are struggling, but who by technicality are not experiencing poverty?
I can answer that. And so, yeah, so what you're referring to is called the benefits cliff. And so what that means is that is an individual or a household that makes just a little bit too much money, or they're right at that level of making too much money to where they don't qualify for resources. So then they fall off of this benefits cliff. So what happens is it ends up keeping people in poverty, because while they may have the desire to go and make $2 an hour more, that $2 an hour more is going to make them ineligible for the resources that they have, which is more to them than the $2 more. So they choose to then just stay in that Alice level because they don't want to lose the benefits that are available. It's where the system's broken. And so that's this dichotomy of figuring out, how do we truly, if we really say that we want people to be on a pathway to economic independence and thrive and not just survive, then we have to look at the systems and how those systems are set up. Because that's the other thing that we're missing in our community, is the lack of robust safety nets, and how those safety nets are set up for people, that maybe somebody just needs that safety net for the immediate crisis so that they can maintain their housing and move on, right? But we don't have systems set up that way. You either have to need all of those services indefinitely, we're going to keep you in poverty then in order to have that, versus you need this immediate back rent for this month just to stabilize you, and then you're on your way. Those systems are not in place.
As someone who isn't religious, do you have any tips to better cultivate that sense of community that you guys are trying to foster?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of ways to do it. I mean, Gen Z gives me so much hope when it comes to things like that. Like, I feel like my kids' generation just does such a good job at finding ways to mobilize, not around necessarily a church or a religious group, right? There's a group in Lowell, the founder is here, called We Care. It's not a religious group at all. And they just come together. We meet regularly at the library, and we look at how can we mobilize for advocacy together, because it's so important. And it's not religiously affiliated, even though some of us are religious getting there. I think it's so important just to have that community. And I think our religious communities have done a lot to push people away and keep people out. And now is the time for us to humbly be like, it's not all about us. And the church has a long history of trying to make it all about us. We need to repent of that and let other people lead us, right? The agnostic and the atheist community, and let them lead, and let us follow them and invest in their efforts, right? We don't need to be in control all the time. And that's what I love about Gen Z, is that I just feel like my kids' generation is so much better at it than mine or ones before me.
Yeah.
Reggie, did you want to add anything?
No.
Okay. You seem very affirmative over there, so I just wanted to check.
She's got kids the same age, he knows.
Just wanted to check.
You got Z's.
Sure. Next question.
I have a question about Together West Michigan. Are you familiar with the work that they're doing? And one of the things that was identified in the greater Grand Rapids area was childcare, especially for the poor. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a huge barrier, people who are making a decent income have to have that conversation of, do we have both parents working, or does one stay home? And do we have they might have the luxury of staying home, right? Where our families, they don't have two parents in the household and they're working two jobs. And so childcare is absolutely one of the biggest barriers, that and transportation, quite honestly. And so there is a lot of work that's being done at the state level, and a lot of advocacy and reform. Governor Whitmer has put a lot of money into developing child care as more of a profession, which I think that's the thing too. When COVID hit, a lot of those smaller, like mom and pop child care facilities closed down. And so those were the ones that were affordable. And so, again, we're trying to make it more of a profession where people see that as a business that they want to start. So there's work. Again, there is advocacy and legislation, and there is work being done around childcare, but it is still just one of the biggest barriers for our families, especially.
Shameless plug, there's a really cool project that's going to be happening at the Rapid Central Station, where a childcare facility is actually going to be built at the bus station. So individuals who take the bus and normally would transfer there, they'll be able to take their children, put them in a qualified childcare facility, and then travel on their way. So
See, it's innovation.
very exciting.
We have to think innovatively about, right, meeting these needs. So that's really cool.
Yeah.
I have a question. My name is Tara. Hi, over here. I work for a faith-based nonprofit, and Reggie in particular, something that you had said about the number of nonprofits in West Michigan. And I think, though I don't know the statistics, similarly could be said about the number of churches in West Michigan as well. And I think given the political climate and our current administration, I think a lot of nonprofits are wrestling with how to fill the gap, particularly serving individuals that we've talked about and we've discussed today. And my curiosity is, maybe Reggie and even Shannon, where do you see the opportunity to better bridge this gap between churches, faith communities, and nonprofits in a way that can be mutually beneficial, not just like a nonprofit coming to a church and saying, hey, we have a pantry that needs to be filled, or we need a hot meal this day. Where's the opportunity to be more authentic in that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, our church, I feel like, has done that really well. Since I've been there, the leader of our church actually is here, our moderator, and she has been a champion for getting Gilda's Club into our building, getting senior neighbors in our building. Open Table was there, Lowell Pride was there, the Women's Club was there, but just getting all these community organizations in our building and collaborating together. We have monthly meetings with leadership from each organization where we talk about what we're doing, how we can collaborate together. And I think it's so important to connect with each other. So we're not operating in silos. I think Reggie mentioned that, right? Silos are just completely ineffective. But if we're trying to work together, I think we can address those things that, churches are scared to get into, right? Because we're afraid, of offending a donor or doing this. We can be fearless when we're together. I think that's the real key.
Yeah. And take advantage of when the Lord interrupts you. Usually when things get really bad, and we think about the pandemic made us resourceful. It made us resilient. It's only when things start to fall apart that we find these commonalities of saying, maybe we don't have to just do this by ourselves, that maybe we can do this together. And sometimes we just have to approach different organizations and say, we're just thinking about this. What do you think? And that could be the impetus or catalyst that says we should be maybe collaborating together. But I find out that sometimes we're like Israelites. We are a stiff-necked people. And sometimes the Lord has to interrupt us. He has to take us down to our knees, and then we'll ask for help. And see it as an opportunity of saying, who else can I be collaborating with? Who else can come alongside of me? And, sometimes that the Lord has to take you down a peg in order that you can look up and see where does your help come from. And that's not always a bad thing.
Hi, so I had a quick question for all of you all. So I wanted to know, has there ever been a time or a moment where you felt like you wanted to give up due to a lot of complications that's going on in the real world? Because you all are like really making a lot of change, and I do want to say thank you for what you all have spoken on today.
Lord have mercy.
What day of the week?
Which 12 you want to hear? It's oh man, there was lots of times when I wanted to give up. When I was pastoring my church, Roosevelt Park Community Christian Reformed Church, there were a lot of times that I hit barriers of folks saying that, well, we need to just take care of ourselves and let them folk take care of themselves. I said, oh, really? That wasn't a problem when it was all Dutch, was it? When did that change? And and we started talking about their own history, and their own history was that most of them were sponsored. I think that's called relief.
Yep.
Sometimes we forget our own path of what we've come from. And then we try to make it harder for the next group that's coming up because we fear they might get ahead of us. And there were a lot of times where through my 20 years of being at Roosevelt of reminding people that you were here before. And when we had to, we accepted our first non-documented member. And you would have thought that all hell was breaking loose. Well, we can't have him come because he's undocumented. I said, oh, really? And then there was one elder that got up and said, who are we that we should deny the same gift that he gave to us? It's only when we're reminded how much we need grace in our own lives. But we have to see it standing right in front of us. It only makes sense to us when the problem is standing right in front of us. And then for those brief moments, God says, they get it. And you had nothing to do with it but be frustrated. But that's just my one.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, you know, I go back to my 10 years that I spent on the front lines, in the trenches with people when they were at their absolute worst. People who, you know, had been homeless and beaten and abused and forgotten about. And, you know, you just show up and day after day, you're like, God, break my heart for what breaks yours, right? And you just show up and you do the work. But the thing that always kept me going was even though there seemed like there was so much hopelessness, it's that one person that God redeemed. And then the other person that God redeemed. And one life at a time, God makes his redemption. And that's what kept me going. Because, you know, you can get beat down and you just think there's nothing we can do, right? And so that's what kept me going and what keeps me going. Yeah.
Yeah, we, you know, as a church, we had a really hard winter. Our Christian education director passed away at the age of 50 from colon cancer after a 2-year struggle and left her 13-year-old son to another woman in our church. And within a month, that woman who was pregnant had to give birth early because they discovered she had stage 4 cancer. She gave birth early. Her child died 2 weeks later. And then, yeah, she's had treatment and since doing much better. But that was where I was like, God, why? This makes no sense, grief upon grief. And it's something I think we all struggled with. But in that, I saw hope in that woman's husband, the woman who had the cancer and got the 13-year-old, and the way he cared for that child like it was his own, and took him along with him through the whole process from the baby's birth to the baby's death. I was like, I have never seen God more clearly reflected than in this man and how he's handled his grief and how he's loved this child who's not his. And it's things like that that have to give me hope in really bleak, horrible situations, you know, that we can still come around each other and still support each other and love each other. And it's not going to make sense, but we just have to be there for each other.
Amen.
Yeah, good question. Next question.
Just had a quick question, kind of piggybacking off of what was said earlier. And Shannon, something you mentioned about kind of the pride of churches and maybe needing to let go of the need to own the task forces or the initiatives. And I was just kind of curious, thinking about the fact that religious communities, whether churches and otherwise, in Kent County, I believe, are among the largest landowners in the state, right after the city of Grand Rapids. And I'm curious if any of you are experiencing conversations about with diminishing in-person communities and with more reliance on digital spaces for finding that community within religious groups. Is there any talk about giving up physical land for the sake of it? And I know that's a large ask, but in the interest of providing units for folks that are experiencing homelessness, is that on anybody's radar at this point?
Yeah, yes, it is. So ICCF, they're taking the lead in Grand Rapids and really kind of West Michigan around that. Looking for parsonages that are no longer being used in gymnasiums and church land and building on that. We are also in Northern Kent having conversations with several of our church partners that are interested in selling. So yes, the conversation is definitely happening.
And there's already a few churches that have been converted into housing.
And Plainfield Township just got approved to convert a church into 4 homes, and they're going to keep the facade of the church so that it looks still like the church, which I think will be pretty interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, our church in Lowell, we're a small community. There's only 100 of us, but we're on 19 acres, and we own our church building, although we have a pretty big mortgage. And we use the building really well. Like, if anything, that building, the person who manages the building is here, and she's just constantly busy because it's always being used, but the property is not always being used. So that's something we have talked about. Like, how can we better utilize the land? Do we create community gardens? Do we have, a burial ground for green burial? We've talked about a lot of options, but we just haven't decided yet what to do with it.
Question back.
Hi, my name is Kyle. I'm a Muslim revert in the greater Grand Rapids area, and my community battles Christian nationalism on a regular basis, especially the past few administrations. Sorry. I'm just wondering what that looks like from within the church and how inter-battles are happening involving Christian nationalism.
It's hard. We're a more progressive community, our church, and it's hard to have partnerships with the other churches in our area. There's 9 in Lowell, and there's different levels of Christian nationalism, and I think all of them. And we're on the far end. Some of our partners who use our building have expressed, why don't you guys have an American flag up in the family center? Why do you have pride flags up? That doesn't make sense. And we're like, well, we always stand with the marginalized and the oppressed like Jesus did. So that's why we have pride flags, but we don't have the American flag. We love our veterans and support them and honor them, but we don't need an American flag up in the church to do that. But it's been hard. People definitely, especially when I was in a more conservative denomination, it was much harder because it just seeps into everything, right? It's in the beliefs, it's in the understanding. A lot of it, I think, is in an arrogance and pride that Christians have had for a long time, that we have something to give the world that the world needs. And it's our job to share our gift with the world, when God is like, I've always been in the world. I'm everywhere. I'm in all of these religions and people groups. And how dare you try to come to another people and say, I can give you God. God is not a commodity. So I think as Christians, we have a lot of assessing to do and looking at ourselves in the mirror and going, this is not right. God is not a commodity to be dealt. God is not something that we own, that we can put in a box and put on a shelf and take out when God's convenient. But it's hard because it has seeped into especially the church and how the church interacts in its communities. Again, it gets to power and control. We tend to, as a church, want to just be in things where we're in charge. So interfaith and ecumenical efforts can be hard because the church gets in the way of itself. But the most effective interfaith and ecumenical work I saw done when I used to go to DC regularly for work was the work where the church could actually sit back and be like, our Muslim brothers and sisters are having a conference. We're going to sit and listen to them. We're not coming with an agenda. We're going to listen and learn and see how we can support them in what they are doing. It's not about what we are doing. And we constantly have to reassess and take that posture, I think, to be effective.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question, if one exists. Kathy.
Megan's worried because I used to work with her, so she's afraid of what I'm going to say. I've done economic development my entire career, Greenville Chamber of Commerce up in your area, then ended up in Michigan Works and then the Right Place with Megan for a period of time. One of the conversations I used to have with employers is wages. And I think that gets back to that whole Alice figure, living wages. That would help this entire situation. And we would have those conversations, show the data, the fact that the revolving, door for employees is no good for anyone, including the business. And just simply paying a couple more bucks an hour makes a big difference. I think part of the problem with the capitalism is that people think that they're owed the right to own a business, and they are not if they cannot pay a living wage. How do we get that message across?
I know the Poor People's Campaign that Reverend William Barber and Liz Theo Harris are running is really passionate about that. That's one of the ways that I've advocated for a living wage, because it is so hard to get people to agree on that one simple thing, right? It should be a no-brainer to pay people what they're worth, but when we're not recognizing the image of God in people, we're not doing that. I don't know if either of you have more to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, again, it goes back to the advocacy work, and getting in front of the businesses. And, we work closely with our local businesses where, you can't deny the story of your staff that comes to work every single day isn't a great employee, but they're accessing our pantry. Like, what's wrong with that picture? Right? I mean, so it's having those real conversations. You think that you're a great business, but there's a miss here. So yeah, I think it's just being able to have those authentic, real conversations with like the businesses.
And we're always having this conversation about, are we going to be a market city or a people city? And if you're going to be a market city, then the conditions in which government and people work towards is for the market. But if you're going to be a people city, then your agenda is about how do you make people's lives better?
Yeah.
And that becomes part of the debate or conversation that we're all kind of having. Especially even in West Michigan. It'd be interesting to take a survey of how would people say Grand Rapids is? What is Grand Rapids? Is it a market city or is it a people city? I'll let you be the judge of that.
Well, and with that, friends, let's thank Shannon and Adrian and Reggie for their presence tonight. Thanks so much. I also want to extend my gratitude to Kyle and our colleagues at the Kaufman Interfaith Institute for partnering with us on this conversation. Thank you to all of you. This is actually our last public program for the academic year. It's been a really lovely season, uniting under the theme of E Pluribus Unum. We hope you've enjoyed it, but we will look forward to seeing you back this fall. We already have a first program sort of on the books and ready to go. September 3rd, we'll be having historian Garrett Graff. We'll be talking about World War II, and that'll be part of the Greatest Generation celebration that's going to be taking place Labor Day week of this coming September. So keep that in mind. And certainly after this, we invite you into the exhibition hall outside to have conversation, talk with others about how you might show up in community and address these issues and share some dessert. So thank you again. Have a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So much.
Thank you.
It's a really great conversation.
Yeah, appreciate it.
I think you guys did such a masterful job of weaving in so many different ideas and just concepts and whatnot. So thank you. Yeah. Pleasure. It's painless for all of you as well.